What if the reason we don't see certain things is because we were never meant to? Not because they don't exist, not because they're imaginary, but because the human body, your eyes, your ears, your brain, only evolved to detect what was necessary to survive on the savannah or in the jungle, not to understand the true structure of reality. Right now you're listening to this, you're surrounded by radiation you can't see, sound waves you can't hear, and forces you can't feel directly. Infrared light is passing through the room. Radio waves from satellites are cutting through your body right now. Low-frequency vibrations are moving through the ground beneath you. And none of this registers consciously. And yet it's all real. Science already tells us that most of reality is invisible and inaudible to humans. What we call normal experience is a narrow slice of a much larger system. A survival interface, a user dashboard, not the source code. So when people report seeing shadows where no shadows should exist, or feeling being watched in empty rooms, or hearing something that no one else hears, the real question may not be, is it paranormal? The question might be, what are we missing? Tonight we're going to talk about ghosts, we're going to talk about cryptids, and we're going to talk about Bigfoot and trail cams. But before we do any of that, we have to talk about what humans literally cannot see or hear, and what science says happens when perception runs into its own hard limits. Because of something that can see us before we see it, that changes everything. Welcome to Arcane Station. I'm your host, Mike Porter. This is the first of a two-part exploration. So tonight we're focusing on how human perception shapes paranormal experience. And in part two, we'll push beyond the senses into technology, physics, and high strangeness. But before we go any further, let's set some ground rules for this episode. This is not an episode about proving the paranormal. I have a personal belief that the paranormal is real. I've seen ghosts. I've heard a howl in the forest of Washington State that I could not identify. I've seen a UAP move in a way that defied physics, so I don't need convincing. I believe. And if you're listening, you probably believe in the supernatural or paranormal as well. What I want to do, though, is look at science, why they aren't convinced, and what that says about humans and their understanding of perception. Science as a discipline doesn't treat paranormal experiences as supernatural by default. It treats them as a phenomena, and then it asks what physical, psychological, or environmental factors could have produced those effects. And here's something important that often gets lost in these discussions. When science explains a paranormal experience, it may see the experiencer, or they may see the experiencer, as misinformed or confused. They don't necessarily think you're crazy. They just think there's some rational explanation for this. And science should start from the assumption that the experience itself is real. What they should question is the interpretation. The core premise of this episode is simple but unsettling. Reality is not the same thing as human perception. Human perception is filtered heavily by your biology. Your senses evolved to keep you alive, not to reveal the true nature of the universe. You don't see most wavelengths of light. You don't hear most frequencies of sound. You don't consciously register many environmental forces that still affect your body and your brain. And every person's reality is different. And when perception runs into something it can't fully process, the brain does what it always does. It fills in the gaps. Tonight we're going to approach the paranormal the same way science does when it's being honest with itself. We'll start with what we know, we'll clearly mark what we infer, and we'll label speculation as that, speculation. There's a concept of God of the gaps. This is from science. They're like, we don't know yet what this thing is, but we know there's something there. But this isn't also going to be any dismissive skepticism either. Because when rational explanations fail, science doesn't jump to ghosts. What it says is we don't know yet. Because that yet is where things get interesting. Once you understand how narrow human perception really is, the paranormal stops sounding impossible. When we talk about visibility, we usually mean something simple. Light hits an object, reflects into our eyes, and then we see it. But that's not how perception really works. Human vision is not a direct feed from reality. It's an interpretation, filtered, compressed, and optimized for survival. Your eyes don't show you everything that's there. They show you what evolution decided was important. The human visual system detects only a very narrow range of electromagnetic radiation, roughly 380 to 750 nanometers. Violet on one end, red on the other. That's the entire visible spectrum. Everything outside of that, infrared, ultraviolet, X-rays, gamma rays, that exists as objectively as visible light. It just doesn't register as vision. And that's the first uncomfortable truth of this episode. Most of reality is invisible to you. Infrared radiation is everywhere. You don't see it, but you feel it as heat. Ultraviolet light can burn your skin and alter your DNA, yet you never perceive it visually. X-rays pass through your body. Gamma rays pass through entire structures. None of those are rare or exotic. They're constant. What we call seeing is a postage stamp size of the window into a continental scale spectrum. And when we want to see beyond that window, we don't evolve new senses, we build tools. Infrared cameras convert heat into color. Night vision amplifies photons your eyes can't process. Medical scanners translate invisible radiation into images of bones and organs. And this raises a critical question. If reality has to be translated for us to perceive it, what happens when something exists that we don't have a tool to translate for us? So here's where this begins to overlap with the idea of auras. You've heard about these before, this glow that people put off. And some people who are sensitive can see this aura. There's even been photography that's happened called Carillion photography that shows this electromagnetic field around a body. Traditionally, auras are described as colored fields of light surrounding living beings. Science doesn't support the idea that humans emit visible light in this way. The body does produce ultra-weak photon emissions through metabolic processes, but they are millions of times too faint to be seen by the naked eye. So no, people aren't literally seeing light radiating from a body. But that doesn't mean they're not seeing anything. The human body is electrically active. Your heart generates an electromagnetic field. Your brain generates one. Your nervous system is constantly firing. You emit heat. You disturb the air around you. So you and your body are never truly still. And human vision, especially peripheral vision, is extremely sensitive to edges, contrast, and motion. Some people have visual systems that are more sensitive on average than others. Their brains suppress less background noise. Their edge detection systems are more active. They notice subtle changes most people filter out automatically. These individuals may perceive faint halos or outlines around people. They may see shimmering or vibrating edges. They may see color fringing against high contrast backgrounds. A sense of a glow around a living being, but not objects, so they may see this glow. And they're not seeing energy as light. They're perceiving instability at boundaries. Living bodies are dynamic. They breathe, they pulse, they radiate heat. They interact electrically with their environment. So, obviously inanimate objects don't do that. To a highly sensitive visual system, that difference can register as a boundary effect, a perceptual glow, an aura. The brain then does what it always does. It assigns a meaning. Across cultures, across centuries, that meaning became language. Aura, halo, spirit light, energy field. Different words for the same core experience. And here's the key point that matters for the paranormal discussion. These perceptions are real experiences, even if the interpretation is symbolic rather than literal. Someone who says they can see an aura isn't necessarily claiming to see photons outside of the visible spectrum. More often, they're describing how their brain renders subtle and visible information into a visual metaphor. This isn't mystical, it's neurological. Your visual system isn't a camera, it's a pattern recognition engine. When it encounters information it can't clearly categorize, it fills in the gaps with shapes, colors, and meanings. The same mechanism explains shimmering figures, shadow forms without clear edges, movement without detail, and presences that can be felt rather than observed. When perception approaches its limit, symbology replaces clarity. So when science says humans can't see outside the visible spectrum, that's true, but incomplete. Humans may not see invisible light, but some people are far better at detecting the effects of invisible forces than others. And once you accept that visibility isn't binary but a spectrum, once you accept that perception varies from person to person, once you accept that reality is subjective, then the idea that some people glimpse things others don't stops sounding delusional. It starts sounding biological. And vision, as it turns out, is only the first crack in the barrier science has for the supernatural. Vision is only one way that reality reaches us, and it may not even be the most manipulative one. Sound has a unique ability to bypass rational thought and go straight to the nervous system. A sudden noise can spike your heart rate before your brain has time to identify what it was. A low rumble can make you uneasy without knowing why, and sometimes the most powerful sounds are the ones you never consciously hear at all. The human auditory system is limited to a specific range of frequencies, roughly between 20 Hz and 20 kilohertz. That range includes everything from deep bass rumbles to high-pitched whines. It sounds wide, but in physical terms, it's just another narrow window, another survival filter. Below 20 Hz is infrasound. Above 20 kilohertz is ultrasound. Both exist constantly in the environment. Both affect the human body, whether you're aware of them or not. And here's where things get strange. Although humans can't consciously hear frequencies below 20 Hz, the body can still detect them. Low-frequency sound waves are large and powerful. They pass through walls, they travel long distances, and they interact directly with the body's tissues and organs. Exposure to infrasound has been linked to a wide range of physical and emotional effects. Feelings of pressure in the chest or ears, dizziness and nausea, headaches and fatigue, anxiety, sadness or unease, and notably a sensation of being watched. At higher intensities, infrasound can cause actual physical vibration within the body. It can stimulate the vestibular system, and that system is responsible for balance, orientation, and spatial awareness. When that system is disrupted, it can result in being disorientation, unease, and emotional instability. And here's the critical part about this. When a body reacts but the ears report silence, the brain looks for another explanation. This is one reason certain locations develop reputations as haunted. Old buildings, industrial areas, caves, tunnels, and even natural landscapes can generate infrasound through wind, machinery, geological activity, or structural resonance. People walk into these spaces and feel fear without context. The environment is influencing their the physiology directly. And the brain does what it always does. It tries to make sense of it. Oh, something must be wrong here. Someone must be watching me. But that feeling is real even if the cause isn't supernatural. So now contrast that with ultrasound, frequencies above human hearing. Humans don't perceive ultrasound directly at all, but animals do. Dogs, bats, rodents, and marine mammals live in an acoustic world far richer than ours. They navigate, communicate, and hunt using sound we don't even register. Elephants use infrasound to communicate across miles. Bats use ultrasound to map their environment with astonishing precision. To them, the world is alive with information that we're completely deaf to. And once again, reality hasn't changed, only the receiver has. This is where frequency in the body becomes central to paranormal experiences. People often report hearing tones or hums no one else notices, feeling vibrations without a clear source, sudden emotional shifts in specific locations, or panic and dread without any visual trigger. In some cases, individuals are simply more sensitive. They may detect pressure changes, low-frequency vibration, or high-frequency electronic noise that others filter out. The human nervous system varies far more than we'd like to admit. Just like with vision, auditory perception is not uniform. And when sound or vibration affects the body without entering conscious awareness, the experience feels external, invasive, and unexplained. You don't think I'm reacting to environmental frequencies. You think something's wrong. This is why sound is such a powerful driver of paranormal interpretation. It doesn't need a face. It doesn't need a shape. It doesn't even need to be heard. It only needs to be felt. Now, it's important to make a careful distinction here. There are reported encounters that involve physical effects, so objects moving, people being touched or pushed, and experiencing poltergeist-like activity. Those cases demand their own scrutiny. But when those overt physical actions are absent, science should first look at alternative explanations before invoking something unseen. And one of those most unlooked explanations is frequency interaction. Because the human body itself has natural frequencies, organs, cavities, and neural systems all resonate within specific ranges. When environmental frequencies align with those natural resonances, the effects can amplify emotionally, physically, and neurologically. Fear doesn't always begin in the mind. Sometimes it begins in resonance. So when people describe haunted locations as places where the air feels heavy, anxiety comes out of nowhere, silence feels oppressive, and the emotions don't match the situation, science shouldn't dismiss that experience. It should ask what frequencies might be present and what the body might be responding to. Because just like vision, hearing isn't about accuracy, it's about survival. And if your nervous system thinks something's wrong, it will tell you whether your conscious mind understands that or not. Which leads us to the next uncomfortable realization. If sound and vibration can influence fear, emotion, and perception without ever entering awareness, then not everyone experiences the same environment the same way. And that's where individual biology enters the picture. One of the most damaging assumptions people make when discussing the paranormal is this, that everyone experiences the world the same way. We don't. Human perception varies dramatically from person to person, and science has known this for a long time. Differences in sensory sensitivity, neural filtering, attention, and interpretation mean that two people can stand in the same room, experience the same environment, and come away with completely different impressions of what happened. This alone explains a massive portion of paranormal disagreement. Some people are more sensitive to low-frequency vibration. Others notice high-pitched electronic noises. Most adults tune out. Some people have stronger peripheral vision. Others are better at detecting motion in low light. Some brains aggressively filter sensory input to reduce noise. Others let more information through. None of these differences are pathological. They're normal human variation. Think about how some people can constantly hear a faint electrical hum in a room while others hear nothing. Or how some people notice flickering lights that drive them crazy, while others are completely oblivious to it. Or how one person senses tension the moment they walk into a space, while others feel nothing unusual at all. These differences are not imagined, they're measurable. In vision, some people show heightened sensitivity to contrast, edge detection, and motion, especially in low light. This can make shadows appear more active, Outlines shimmer and movement seem present where others see no movement whatsoever. In sound, some people remain sensitive to frequencies that most adults lose with age. In vibration, some people register pressure changes in their bodies long before they consciously notice anything is wrong. Now layer emotion on top of that. The brain doesn't process sensory input in isolation. Everything is filtered through emotional centers, especially in the amygdala, which is responsible for threat detection. If your brain is already alert, stressed, or fatigued, it will prioritize ambiguous stimuli as potential threats. This is why fear can come before an explanation. You instantly have this emotion rise and you feel as if you were in danger prior to even having some sort of, it's like a sixth sense that takes place. And that's why two witnesses can explain or experience the same moment and remember it completely differently. It's not because their memory failed, but because perception diverged from the start. This is especially important when people talk about seeing things that others don't. Someone with heightened peripheral sensitivity may notice movement just outside direct vision. Someone with strong pattern recognition tendencies may detect structure in shadow. Someone whose brain suppresses less background noise may perceive visual auditory static others may never hear. When that happens, the brain tries to interpret what it's receiving, and interpretation is where belief enters. Cultural expectations, personal history, and emotional state shape how ambiguous inputs get labeled. A shadow becomes a figure, a vibration becomes a presence, a sensation becomes something watching. But here's the crucial point. The experience itself is real. The nervous system genuinely reacted. Sensory information genuinely entered this awareness. What's uncertain is the cause, but not the perception. This is why science doesn't automatically dismiss reports of paranormal experiences, or at least they shouldn't. Even when it can't confirm a supernatural explanation, it should instead look at variability. It looks at thresholds. It looks at who is more likely to notice what others missed. And it acknowledges something that's deeply uncomfortable for skeptics and believers alike. There is no single objective human experience of reality. We don't walk through the same world. We walk through overlapping versions of it, shaped by biology, shaped by culture, shaped by our families. All of that shapes how we look at the world, which explains why paranormal encounters are often personal, inconsistent, difficult to reproduce, and resistant to people agreeing on what exactly happened. And it explains why witnesses can be sincere but still disagree about what happened. So when someone says, I saw something, and the other person standing right next to them says there was nothing there, the scientists don't have to choose sides. They can see that both statements can be true. Because perception isn't about accuracy, it's about how much information your system allows through. And once you accept that some people perceive more while others perceive less, the paranormal starts to look less like a collection of falsehoods and more like a collection between human limits and a very large, very complicated reality. And more like a collision between human limits and a very large, very complicated reality. Which brings us to the next step, because perception doesn't just vary. Sometimes it fails outright. And when it does, the brain fills in the gaps with meaning. So up to this point, we've talked about limits, what humans can't see, can't hear, and don't all perceive the same way. But there's another layer that matters just as much. What happens when perception doesn't just vary, but it breaks down entirely? This is where many paranormal experiences actually live. Not in what the senses detected, but what the brain does when the sensory input is incomplete, ambiguous, or contradictory. The human brain is not a passive receiver of information. It's an active interpreter. It predicts what should be there, compares that prediction to incoming data, and then fills in whatever doesn't line up. Most of the time this works beautifully, but under certain conditions, low light, unfamiliar environments, fear, fatigue, stress, that system starts making aggressive assumptions, and that's when the overlap begins. Think about the most common paranormal reports across cultures and time periods. Shadow figures, shimmering movement, a sense of a presence, unexplained sounds, the feeling of being watched. Notice what's missing? Complete, clear detail. These experiences are almost never sharp or well-lit or precise. They exist at the edges of perception. Peripheral vision, dim environments, moments of transition between sleep and waking, or emotionally charged situations. That's not a coincidence. Peripheral vision in particular is optimized for motion detection, not detail. It sacrifices clarity for speed. If something moves just outside your direct line of sight, your brain reacts first and asks questions later. That's a survival feature, and it's one that's kept our ancestors alive. But it also means that in low information environments, the brain is quick to interpret anything ambiguous as potentially dangerous or significant. A shifting shadow becomes a form. A sound without a source becomes a presence. A psychological or a physiological reaction becomes a threat. Once that interpretation is made, the emotional centers of the brain, especially the amygdala, light up. Fear reinforces attention. Attention reinforces meaning, and meaning reinforces memory. At that point, the experience is locked in. You found something that made you fearful, therefore it's something that I'm going to hold on to as a dangerous situation. The brain doesn't distinguish between internally generated signals and externally sourced ones when constructing an experience. If your nervous system reacts, the experience is real, regardless of whether the trigger came from the environment, the body, or the brain itself. This is why people report presences rather than objects. A presence is not something you see, it's something you feel. It's the brain's threat detection system activating without a visible cause. The mind senses that something is wrong, but it can't localize it. It can't fill in the gap with an actual thing, so it fills in the gap with this randomness. But randomness that's shaped by culture, expectation, and personal belief. So in one culture, the presence becomes a ghost, or in another, it might be a demon. In another, it might be an intruder or a shadow person. It's the same neurological process, but it has a different cultural narrative wrapper. This also explains why paranormal experiences often happen in clusters, why certain locations develop reputations. Once a place is associated with fear or anomaly, people enter it already primed. Their attention sharpens, their sensory filters loosen, and ambiguous input is more likely to be interpreted as meaningful. And the environment doesn't have to do much at all. There could be a low-frequency vibration, a flickering light, a temperature gradient, a strange echo. That's enough. The brain connects the dots and presents a story that feels external, even when the underlying process is internal. This is where skeptics often get it wrong. They assume that explaining a paranormal experience neurologically means it wasn't real. But neuroscience says the opposite. The experience is real, the fear is real, the memory is real. What's uncertain is the explanation that caused that fear. And here's where this ties back to everything we've discussed so far. If humans perceive only a fraction of reality, they respond physiologically to invisible forces and interpret incomplete data symbolically and very widely in sensory sensitivity, then paranormal experiences are not anomalies. They are expected side effects of how perception works at its limits. And when those limits are pushed by darkness, silence, or isolation, the line between perception and interpretation blurs pretty fast. This doesn't mean that ghosts are proven, but it does mean something crucial. You don't need superstition to get paranormal experiences. You only need a brain doing its best to survive in an environment it doesn't fully understand. Which brings us to a place where people expect clarity, technology, Cameras don't experience fear. Sensors don't imagine things. So if something's real, surely technology should catch it, right? That assumption leads directly into one of the most controversial questions in paranormal research. If cryptids like Bigfoot exist, if ghosts are real, then why aren't cameras catching them? Why are they so bad at catching them? Up to this point, we've stayed firmly grounded in the human experience. We've talked about what we can't see, what we can't hear, how perception varies from person to person, how the brain fills in gaps when information is incomplete or conflicting. We've seen how shadows form on the edges of vision, how we can trigger fear with just sound, how environments can influence emotion and interpretation, and how entirely real experiences can emerge from the very human limits of our sights and sounds. In other words, we've established something critical. We don't need the supernatural to explain why people experience the paranormal. That doesn't mean the story ends here, though, because perception alone doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain why technology fails in consistent ways. It doesn't explain why certain encounters seem aware, and it doesn't explain why experiences cluster around specific location. And it doesn't explain why some phenomena don't behave like real things in animals or people. This phenomena may act completely outside of our understanding. So in part 2, we're going to go beyond the human perception and start asking harder questions, like why trail cameras and sensors fail when we expect them to succeed, whether cryptids like Bigfoot could possibly detect infrared or artificial monitoring, the idea of non-biological or frequency-based phenomena, extra dimensions and why modern physics doesn't rule them out, and why certain locations might act as hotspots for high strangeness. So part 1 was about how humans experience reality. Part 2 is going to be about what happens when reality doesn't behave the way we expect it to. If this episode left you questioning how much of the world you actually perceive, good. That discomfort is where real curiosity begins. If you've had an experience that didn't fit neatly into explanation, something you saw, heard, or felt that stayed with you, you're not alone. And you're not automatically wrong for questioning it. If you want to share your story, you can reach out through Arcane Station website or connect with us on social media. We read every submission, even the ones without answers. If you've enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing, leaving a review, or sharing it with someone who enjoys exploring the edges of science, perception, and high strangeness. And when you're ready, next week, come back for part 2, and we'll move beyond the limits of human senses and start asking what happens when reality itself refuses to stay in bounds. Until then, what you perceive is only a fraction of what's out there. Have a good night.